We are wrapping up our The Church is Fine series because this has been a good series, I think, and want to end with a little bit of hope. I know it has been a little bit of maybe like a downer series for some of us. Depends, I guess, on your outlook on these things. But here are some of the things we've covered. We've covered Christian nationalism. We've covered racism. We've covered the Bible. We covered integrity. We covered judgmentalism. We covered these things that are really, I guess you could say, fires within the church. Things that are not helpful. Things that are reasons that people are leaving the church. Reasons that people don't trust the church. And just deep concerns over what the future of the church looks like if these fires don't get put out, right? And so we've kind of done it in a joking way in the sense of the meme here of like, everything's fine. You know, the house is on fire and you're sitting there with your cup of coffee, just everything's fine. I'm just going to ignore it. And in a lot of ways, that's kind of how the church has, like, for the church to come together for 5 Sundays and to have honest conversations about these 5 topics the way we have isn't something I witnessed growing up. And isn't something I see a whole lot of other churches doing. And I think the more honest we can be about the situation, the more we aren't this meme sitting here saying the church is fine. Everything's fine. Church is fine. We're actually making a different claim. We're saying the church is in crisis. There is fire. And this isn't a time to sit idly by. It's a time to grab a pail of water and start trying to do everything we can to put out these fires. Because before long, we're really going to see the impact, not only of how many people these fires have burned, but even how it is burning up our witness in the world and our own faith in the process. So we have a problem. I think we've acknowledged that. I think if you just go back and listen to the last 5 Sundays, you would be hard pressed to say we don't have a problem, right? And I just want to give a little more context for this from a broader overview. This was released just a few weeks ago. This was from Pew Research, an exhaustive study that's actually doing some projections on the future. So I just want you to look first at 1972. 1972, Pew Research determined that 90% of Americans were Christian. Now, I want to be clear about what that might mean. That might just mean, oh, I went to church once, or I was raised in a Christian household. Their definition of Christian is not necessarily devoted, goes every Sunday. Like, their criteria is not maybe a criteria that you were handed growing up for what it meant to be Christian. But ultimately, those who self-identify as Christians, would be the way of saying it, was 90%. In less than 50 years, that number has gone from 90 to 64. Okay? And there's been a serious decline taking place, especially in the last 5 to 7 years. What they say is, if no one changes their religion from 2020 to 2070, if no one does, then we'll be at 54%, still a 10% decline. If there's steady switching, 46%, and they give all these criteria for this. There's actually a whole thing. If you just Google Pew Research, decline of Christianity, if you just Google that, you will see a whole write-up, and there's multiple other people who have written off of that who have given more opinion. This is more just the data, but there's also more opinion out there and things about this, but if the rising disaffiliation of Christianity is without limits, it could be as low as 35% by 2070. And I would say, I think it could even be worse than that, personally. As a pastor who is with people who are feeling this disillusionment, even with the church. Now, the question becomes, will they still self-identify with Jesus, with Christianity, but just not go to church? Does that make sense? I think you're going to have this huge wing of people. I would love to see how much of that 35% ends up being people who still would affiliate themselves with Jesus, but would not affiliate themselves with the church, right? So I just want to be clear that, like, what we've talked about is very relevant right now. This is Pew Research. This has been talked about in every news publication that of any credibility. Just for example, this week. This is 2 days ago. The New York Times podcast that they produce, The Daily, and it's a very interesting podcast. You should go listen to this podcast. They talk about evangelicalism in America, and they talk about all these different problems that we've been talking about over the last 5 weeks, and how that's impacting even pastors' desires to pastor their churches. Leaders within those churches who have given their life to service, whether that's in a kids ministry, in a small groups ministry, in a board member position, feeling of like, I can't invest in this anymore. And these are people who have been raised in these contexts, in these churches, feeling this sense of, I have to stop. I don't know if I can continue this. And obviously, in this particular case, they're linking it to the rise of Trumpism within churches. And we're seeing this. We're seeing this tension that exists. And they talk about that. And they talk about it in a very interesting way. In honestly, a nonpartisan way, which I really appreciated. But a reality that, like, having conversations of challenge in the church, where you challenge someone's ideology, has become nearly impossible in certain contexts. So what we're talking about with these fires connects very deeply, I think, to the answer, connects very deeply to our mission. So I'll just read this again. The Belong Collective is an inclusive, Jesus-centered, I want to emphasize Jesus-centered community, practicing the way of love for the good of all. We are a Jesus-centered community. So, what does it mean to be Jesus-centered? This is the question, right? What does it mean to be Jesus-centered? Today I want to give 2 answers, and I could probably give 10. Like, if we were to just do like a long-form conversation about what it means to be Jesus-centered, I could give 10. But today we're just going to focus on 2 that I think are really important, and I actually think this is what the revival that is needed within the churches is to be Jesus-centered. To begin to filter our actions, our beliefs, our mindset, the way we operate as a community through the lens of Jesus. Because there's so much that exists in just the 5 things we've covered of the fires that are in the church. And those aren't all the fires in the church either. But just those 5 things reveal a lack of Jesus-centeredness as we approach those topics, right? All right, so number 1. Jesus is the lens through which we interpret the Bible. Jesus is the lens through which we interpret the Bible. I would argue American evangelical Christianity may need a trip to the eye doctor to update its prescription. Right? Like, the lenses they're seeing the Bible through don't look anything like Jesus. And it's leading to a blurry outcome. A really blurry outcome. My son just actually got his prescription updated just in the last week, and he had to get new glasses. And the interesting thing about that is, like, I don't wear glasses, but it was like he was getting headaches for the first couple of days of his new prescription. Maybe those of you who wear glasses, you know what that's like. And it's like, this is going to be a painful reality for the church to apply a new lens. It's going to lead to some painful outcomes for a while, but ultimately we'll be better for it in the end. Right? Like, we have to apply the lens of Jesus when we interpret the Bible. You know, Hebrews 1:3 says, the Son is the radiance of God's glory, the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. And what I think is interesting is the author of Hebrews starts the book. This is the 3rd verse in the book, in the letter, really. But the 3rd verse, and it wasn't a verse initially when it was written. It was just the beginning, the introduction. And the author makes it very clear to these Jewish people, these people who have a great investment in the law, the old way of doing things, that Jesus is the exact representation of God. That language, exact representation, is an interesting phrase. Because to claim that Jesus is the exact representation is to assume that God has not been exactly represented previously. If we do not read the Bible through a Jesus-centered lens, we may miss the exact representation. If I want to make an argument for going to war, I can go read Joshua, and I can give you all the reasons we should go to war. But you know what I can't do? I can't read Jesus. It's very interesting when we apply Jesus to our filter, our lens through how we read everything. It begins to change us and change the outcomes that we come away with. I often wonder how different the church would be if we emphasized the radical call of the Sermon on the Mount. One of the most moving moments I had was when I was in Israel and I got to go be at the Mount where Jesus is believed to have given his sermon. And in that same location, read a portion of the Sermon on the Mount and really reflect on the greatest sermon ever told. I actually got a chance to film some of it, so I'm going to share some of that with you right now. So I'm standing here at the place in which it's believed that Jesus gave his Sermon on the Mount. So this is the Mount of Beatitudes, and as you can see the Sea of Galilee in the background. I just want to read some of that amazing sermon from Jesus. Now when he saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down, likely this mountainside. His disciples came to him, and he began to teach them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons and daughters of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." Jesus then continued and said, "You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled by men. You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden, neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before men, that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven." I wonder if we organized around the Sermon on the Mount, what kind of community we might be, right? If we organized around letting our light shine, letting our good deeds be what we were known for, what that might look like, right? Number two, kind of flowing right from that, we're the salt and light of the world. And I only have 2 points today. Authentic Christianity looks like, acts like, and loves like Jesus. And that's hard to say because I've almost wanted to write a book just called Christianities. Because there's so many. Like, right? We think of Christianity as just a belief system or a religion. But like when you dive into Christianity, like there are so many different conclusions. There are some people who read Revelation like it is the center of the entire book. There are some people who read the Old Testament like the Ten Commandments like it's the center. There are some people who read Jesus like it's the center. There are some people who read Paul like it's the center. And they're all coming to very different conclusions, and they're all calling it Christianity. And so like not just that there's some dogmatic differences, but there's some even deep differences within Christianity. So when I say authentic Christianity, I'm going to be honest, that's kind of a prideful statement. But at the same time, I think any Christianity that doesn't look like, act like, or love like Jesus, it seems to not bear the name of the purpose in which it's meant, like Jesus Christ, right? Like Jesus Christ. We're not looking like Christianity. Frederick Douglass kind of said this. He once said, between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, I recognize the widest possible difference. Read that one more time. Between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, I recognize the widest possible difference. We need a revival of authentic Christianity. One that looks like, acts like, and loves like Jesus. Now that's a high call, an incredible challenge. I'm not saying we need a perfect Christianity, because that's what some people hear when you say something like this. I'm saying this should be our target. This should be what we're thriving for. This should be what we're going for. Certainly not what we're railing against, right? When we think of the direction of the church, when we think of that chart, it's like, I think of it more not as like someone who's running a business and like, wow, we're going to lose a lot of the market share over the next 50 years based on that. Like, I think of it as, wow, we must be living really uninteresting lives if people are doing everything they can to run away from this. We must be emphasizing something completely different if people are walking away from this. Because we have this story, this way of living that is self-sacrificial love modeled by Jesus that captures people. When you love your neighbor the way you love yourself, it impacts your neighbor. When you love your enemies and bless those that curse you, it reframes everything. It's hard to walk away from that kind of love. These are both Jesus statements, by the way, right? These are both points of emphasis made by Jesus. When you extend grace to someone the way Jesus looked at a group of Pharisees and said, "You who are without sin, cast the first stone." When you extend that kind of grace to somebody who is deserving of the punishment they're about to receive based on the laws and morals of that culture. When we look at someone in our culture who's deserving of punishment and we say, who am I to throw a stone? When we live by that kind of grace code, wow, that's transformative. But when we don't look like Jesus, when we don't even strive to get there or try our best in those circumstances to model grace and love, or have a community that we're centered on that doesn't even think that's a value, it's creating all kinds of problems for Christianity. And so, the church is fine. If we want to operate that way, we certainly can. We can certainly say the church is fine. My belief is we need to be a community that, while we definitely acknowledge and we share our passion for any number of fires in the church and how they need to be put out, we also do so in a way that looks like Jesus. Because one thing I've learned is it's very easy to have an awakening moment where the scales come off your eyes and you wake up to something that you didn't see before. And when you wake up, to become the same version of that thing that you're angry about, just on the other side. And so we have to look like, act like, and love like Jesus even as we put these fires out. if we want anything to remain afterwards. That's the challenge of this series. How do we take all that energy and desire for justice? Because it burns in me, I'll tell you that. But do it in a way that invites people to open their eyes. That creates space for them after, not just shame. That models a restorative culture over a cancel culture. That's what Jesus looks like. And that's what we need to step into. And I feel like there's this great opportunity before us as a community, the Belong Collective, to be the inverse of what we see on display right now. To not be sitting at the table saying the church is fine, but instead to be addressing these causes and these needs in the way of Christ. So let's pray for that. Good and gracious God, meet us in our place of discontent. The moments where we see things, are triggered by things that we know do not reflect you, but are being spoken by your followers, by people who claim your name. God, remind us of the time where these disciples who had been following you for 3 years walked into a city and tried to call fire down from heaven. And you showed them grace. God, remind us that we don't follow you perfectly either. So as we stand up for what's right, as we put fires out, as we do our best to express your love and your truth in this world, may we be people who model grace and love in the midst of that. May your Spirit be with us, guiding us, showing us when it's time to say the bold thing and when it's time to respond with a kind word or a question to inquire more. Never assuming the intent of a person, but instead trying to understand how they've come to that conclusion. God, make us soft where we need to be soft and make us stand firm where we need to stand firm. Let it not be our ego or our pride, but instead a deep desire to see the church shaped to look more like this authentic Christianity that is shaped by Jesus. Be with us in this journey. This is challenging stuff, to love in this way, to act in this way, to live in this way. And let this community, this space here, be a space of encouragement where we can come together and even like in the lobby talk about the challenges we've dealt with this week, whether it's the family member or the person we work with or any number of things, and be able to encourage one another toward a Jesus-centered response through the difficulties of this life. God, that is our desire. Meet us in that place. Amen.